Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a nice morning tea. I just wanted to introduce our very next talk. I'm really excited for this one. Our next talk is by Angus and Laura. If you read their conference bio, it starts with Angus and Laura are best friends. You're all clapping, you can clap now, yeah. One thing that I want you to know about this is that this is Angus and Laura's first conference talk ever, so give it up for them.
Hello friends, how are we all doing after our delicious bubble teas? Going well? So as Alex said, I'm Laura.
And I'm Angus.
And today we're going to be chatting to you about OAuth. More specifically, where did it come from? Where did it go?
And what the heck is an old flow?
So every good dilemma, every good conference talk starts with a story, right? So we tried to do one. Small caveat, any trademarked characters or apps referenced today are purely coincidental. So we've got this character, say they're Puss in Boots. And Puss in Boots loves using this app called Notion for making aesthetic notes. Specifically, they use the www.notion.so website. So with that in mind, they use Notion and they also use this other thing called Google Drive, maybe you've heard of it, for storing docs and stuff. And Puss thinks to themselves, boy, I'd really love to import my docs into Notion. And ideally there's some way they can do this where Notion reaches out to Google and goes like, hey, give me the docs, thanks. And Google sends those through. Ideally without, I don't know, someone bad getting access to those docs along the way. And so with the scene set, let's jump straight into the first attempt at solving this problem, the password sharing era. So here we are with Puss in Boots, Notion, and Google Drive. And in the password sharing era, Puss in Boots would have been like, hey Notion, my Google Drive password is this. And then using that password, Notion can reach out to Google, log in as Puss in Boots, and grab those docs. So problem solved, but probably not the best. For one, if Puss in Boots decides that they want to remove Notion's access to Google Drive, they actually have to go log in, change their password. Bit annoying. Also, because we've given Notion our password, they can do kind of whatever they want in Puss in Boots' Google account. So you want to edit some docs? Great. Want to change Puss in Boots' password? Do it. You want to delete Puss in Boots' account? Probably also okay. Yeah. And because Puss in Boots has given Notion their password, they need to store it to use it in the future. And because they're using it, they're probably storing it in plain text, which means that, I don't know, someone bad might be able to steal that password in the future. Yeah. And so I hear you thinking, surely there's a better way. This talk definitely doesn't allude to it. And surely no one does this anymore, right? Right? Definitely not the mortgage broking platform I was on last week that asked me to give them all my bank passwords. Yeah. But we're on to bigger and better things because we have OAuth 1, the start of something new.
Laura, didn't we drop these slides because OAuth 1's deprecated?
Well, fancy you asked that, Angus. Why should we care about OAuth 1, knowing that there's an OAuth 2 to come in the future? Well, for one, we still see OAuth 1 used around the interwebs today. You might see it at some places like this. And also, OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 share a bunch of common concepts. So by talking about OAuth 1, we can get the foundations down, and then it's not so scary by the time we get to OAuth 2. And OAuth what now? We've said this word a lot. What does it actually mean? It means open authorization. And it's all about giving websites permission to access your stuff on other sites. It's this big long doc that a bunch of people came together and wrote, and now we can use it. And one of the key features of this big long doc is this thing called access tokens. Previously, in the password sharing era, you'd give Notion your password, they'd have access to do absolutely all the things you can do in your account. But now, with our magical access tokens, you can give websites permission to do only some things in your account. This might be things like reading some docs, seeing your email address, or accessing your contacts. Notably, not changing your password. So here we are with our lovable characters, but we've got a fancy standard now. So we can't use these regular names, we have to use fancy names. And to set the scene, some time ago, the developers at Notion were probably thinking, hey, I want to implement a Google Drive integration. We have like a lot of users wanting to put their Google Docs in Notion. So they reach out to Google. They probably do like some registration form. And then if Google's cool with that, they'll send back this ID and a secret so that Notion and Google can use that in future communications. So then back to the present, we have our lovable Puss in Boots wanting to view their Google Drive docs in Notion. And Notion reaches out to Google and says like, here's my ID, let's do the thing. And Google sends through a request token, which is currently set to unauthorized. Now, what is a request token? It's this token that we exchange later to get our magical access token. So now that Notion has that, they redirect Puss in Boots through to Google to go and authenticate. Might look like this, maybe you've seen it before. And Puss in Boots will log in and then Google will say like, hey, do you want to give access for these permissions to Notion? Might look a bit like this. In this case, we've got like see and download all of your Google Drive files. Seems like something Notion will need. And if Puss in Boots chooses to accept that, they get redirected back to Notion. And that request token from before is now set to authorized. So now that that's happened, Notion's like, cool, let's exchange that request token for a magical access token. So they send that through, Google verifies that that token's legitimate, and all going well, sends back an access token. And now, using the access token, Notion can reach out to Google and get back the docs. Awesome, problem solved. But I hear you thinking, isn't this like kind of weird, convoluted, and confusing? Why do we need to do a token exchange rather than just get back the access token in the first step? So let's chat about token exchange, shall we? So it turns out these access tokens, because they give permission to do things in other websites, they're pretty lucrative for like someone bad, like fairy godmother. So when this token exchange happens, Notion and Google Drive communicate via what we call a back channel. So this means that Puss in Boots can't see this activity occurring. Because in OAuth, a lot of activity goes through Puss in Boots' browser. You saw we had quite a few redirects going on. And what this means is that if someone bad could like somehow compromise Puss in Boots' browser, then they can steal that token. But because we do token exchange, all they can steal is the request token. And then if fairy godmother goes to do the token exchange with Google, say they like send that through, try to get an access token, Google's going to say no, because Notion and Google have shared an ID and a secret earlier. So they know how to talk to each other. So hopefully that explains why it's a bit convoluted and why we do token exchange. And there we have it. We have our Google Drive doc in Notion, looking much more aesthetic now. Problem solved, right? But then why does OAuth 2 exist? Like, what was that whole next step? Turns out in every single request in the diagram you've seen so far, there's some kind of complicated signing that has to go on. And signing stuff is kind of hard to implement for developers. Also, we've got like mobile, desktop apps, single-page web apps now. And this flow doesn't work super well for them because back channels in a single-page web app don't really exist. So enter
OAuth 2, electric boogaloo. Pretty similar, but also a few major differences. But don't worry, we still have our friends, the access token and the token exchange step that you'll be seeing here again. And once again, we have our favorite characters, poorly rigged Puss in Boots, Notion, and Google Drive. Except new framework, new terminology. So now we have resource owner, client, resource server, and authorization server. And the main difference here is just that the party authenticating you isn't necessarily the one that holds your information or resources that you're going to be accessing. So once again, Puss in Boots comes over to Notion and says, hey, I'd really like to see my Google Drive files in Notion. And Notion knows how to service this request because it's previously made a backyard trade deal with Google where it's received a client ID and a client secret. So with this information in hand, Puss in Boots can be redirected from Notion to Google's authentication server with a few parameters. So all these little blobs that you see, code, ID, scope, these are just URL parameters that would happen in the request. So in this case, we have code to signify that we'll be doing the authorization code flow, which is just the most common flow you see in web apps for OAuth. We have that Notion's client ID from before, and we also have this scope, which we'll talk about in just a second. And importantly, this state value. And at this point in time, Notion should have also already stored this state value in a cookie on Puss in Boots' browser, and more on that later. So from here, once again, as we saw in OAuth 1, Puss in Boots will be asked to sign into Google if he doesn't already have a session. And he'll also be asked to accept this consent screen. And this consent screen basically just corresponds to the scope values that were sent over in the request. So once again, in this case, we have Google Drive read-only and also asking for permissions to see Puss in Boots' email as it appears on his Google account. So if Puss in Boots chooses to accept, he'll be redirected back to the Notion web app with that state value and also this auth code, authorization code. And so at this point in time, Notion should now check that the state in the URL matches the state stored in the cookie earlier. And the point of this is just to make sure that the person who initiated the request is the same one who finished it. So if everything checks out, Notion can now take its client ID, its client secret, and the authorization code, and exchange it with Google's authorization server over this back channel, which we also saw in OAuth 1. And as a reminder, that just means that Puss in Boots and other nefarious actors can't see this happening because it's on the server side. Now, Google's authorization server can check that all these details match up to what it has on file, essentially. And if everything checks out, it'll redirect or send back a request to Notion's web app with the access token, the scopes that it's valid for, which are basically just the scopes that were requested earlier, and also its expiry. And Notion's like, sick, now I can go over to Google Drive and I can ask for some documents for Puss in Boots and get those documents back. So, you know, it's all looking pretty straightforward at this point in time. But don't panic. There's going to be some really useful resources in the handout, and you just got to take your time and step through it. So yeah, moving on to OIDC.
Whoa. Angus, isn't this a cyber conference? Are we going to talk about security?
Yeah, I suppose we should. So let's have a look at like an example of one thing that could go wrong here, which is a lack of state validation. So imagine, once again, that we're back at this point in the flow where we're being redirected from Notion web app to Google's authorization server to obtain that authorization code. Except in this case, Notion isn't going to be storing that state value in any cookies. And there'll be no state validation whatsoever. And so Fairy Godmother, our nefarious actor in this case, is going to be like, beautiful. I can like start this same request as Puss in Boots did in the beginning. I can sign into Fairy Godmother's Google account. She accepts the terms. But this time, before being redirected all the way back to Notion, she takes that request, she drops it with, or blocks it with something like a web proxy, and then can basically take this URL. And so once again, those parameters are those values just match up to parameters in a large URL. So we can just send this off to Puss in Boots over email or DM or whatever. And if Puss in Boots has the misfortune of clicking on this link, they'll be redirected to Notion. Notion goes, nah, I'm not going to bother checking the state. Looks good to me. And we'll happily connect Puss in Boots' Notion account to Fairy Godmother's Google Drive. And you may be wondering, why do we care? You know, we can see Fairy Godmother's Drive files in our account or in Puss in Boots' account. We have to kind of remember that you can connect anything to Notion, right? And some of these are going to be more important than others. And when we look at other apps, maybe they're doing way more important things. I know you can see your bills in Notion or something like that. So we can't do this to Puss in Boots. So please remember, there's one thing you get out of this talk, it's always validate your state. Super important. So now we're going to talk about OIDC and the kind of modern lay of the land in terms of OAuth. So OIDC, or OpenID Connect, is basically a thin layer on top of the OAuth 2 framework. I say framework because the OAuth 2 spec is kind of this loosely defined thing where there's a lot of stuff that's just left up to the implementer, and this is designed to help it be flexible and malleable, and you can use it to kind of do stuff slap authentication on top of what was otherwise just an authorization flow. And this is great for users because it means that we can chuck username and password logins and signups in the bin. And we just have to remember one password for our favorite social provider like Google, Facebook, or Apple. And I'll hand back over to Laura to talk us through the mechanics of that.
Yeah, so here we are again. As we said, OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth 2. It's basically exactly the same with one key difference. So we're just going to chat through that one thing. And that is at token exchange. So Notion will reach out to Google with the authorization code and that other information we talked about before. Google's going to check that and then respond with our familiar access token, a scope, and one new thing, an ID token. Now, an ID token takes the form of a JWT, or JSON Web Token. It's basically this glob of information that makes sense to computers and looks like gibberish to us, but it has some sections. Notably, it has a signature to stop other people tampering with the information in it, and it has a payload, which stores some information. So in an ID token payload, what we see is information from Google about Puss in Boots. So things like their email, their name, maybe their date of birth. And this is really handy because Notion can take this token, verify the signature and some other information to make sure it hasn't been tampered with, and then basically yoink this to make an account for Puss in Boots on its own platform. And that's how social logins work. And there's really so much more. You've got your standard OAuth 2 framework. You've got other things like the threat model, public clients, all these things. I think in total 17 RFCs comprise of the OAuth 2 spec now. And this was Angus and I trying to learn OAuth because there's a lot of docs, but never fear, friends. We've all gone through it. And a really handy place to start if you're interested in this and you want to learn more about the security side of it is this OAuth 2.0 threat model and security considerations doc. This one kind of steps through what the main vectors of attack are and what some mitigations would be, and actually justify the existence of a lot of the other docs. So if you have to start anywhere, start here. And what does the future hold? No one really knows, but what we can do is reflect on what we've learned today, which is that OAuth 2 has a whole lot of docs, and that's okay. We can make it through together with the power of friendship.
Always validate your state. We see this all the time out in the wild still, so if you ever have the misfortune of implementing an OAuth flow, please keep an eye out for this one.
OAuth is for authorization or giving access to stuff, and OIDC is for identity or logging in.
And yeah, it's all still pretty complicated, to be honest. So that's all, folks. Thanks for coming. See you for the exam.
Can we just unplug this?